There's this reality show that I like to watch, in which a stern, nanny-type looking character enters the homes of desperate dog owners to help them manage their misbehaving pups. And there's one episode that stood out to me. In it, the owner of a Chihuahua called in the dog expert to help her because this Chihuahua was misbehaving, it was rude, it was constantly growling at her, snapping at her, refusing to go on a leash, weeing in the house, and generally being a menace. Her words, not mine. And she had tried everything that she knew how to do to get this dog to behave and to interact and cooperate with her, and nothing was working. So she concluded this was probably a bad dog, or at least it didn't like her. So this nanny, this dog expert, came in and she observed them for a while. She asked some questions and then very quickly figured out what was going on. You see, this dog owner had owned cats all her life. She knew them very well. She'd grown up with them. And when her previous cat died, she decided to change things up a little and got a Chihuahua. She figured it's about the same size, so how different could it really be? And what she didn't do was figure out, how is a dog different from a cat? How is the Chihuahua communicating differently? And so, because she wasn't aware of how communication looks differently for that dog, she concluded that this dog was behaving badly. She interpreted this behavior as an attempt at dominance, rejecting her, and being vicious. You see, because she did not understand the communication of this animal, she didn't realize that it was communicating at all. She wasn't a bad person. She was devastated that this dog didn't like her. She loved it, and she wanted those cuddles and those pets. Anyway, the dog expert then sat her down and explained to her, a Chihuahua is not a small cat, and you need to listen and pay attention to the way that he's communicating, because he was communicating very, very clearly. She just didn't know. And so, of course, by the end of the episode, the dog expert had taught her how to read and understand her dog, and she changed her approach, and they lived happily ever after. So what can we learn from this example of interspecies communication? Well, at the very least, that successful communication has to be a two-way street. Now, in interpersonal communication, we use words, but also gestures, facial expressions, the way that we move our body, the tone of voice to exchange ideas, information, and feelings with each other, to express ourselves, to learn, to teach. Now, usually, person A will communicate something to person B, and then person B receives it, interprets it, and then responds accordingly. And that's how you get a communication cycle going. But for this to work, both parties must realize that communication is indeed happening. And they must agree upon what communication means. So if both people communicate in a similar way, then that's fairly straightforward a lot of the time. But if there's a mismatch between communication styles and added a lack of awareness of this mismatch, you can have a communication breakdown. Now, to clarify, I am in no way suggesting that there are different species of humans, the way that dogs and cats are different. But there definitely are different communication styles between individuals, but also across groups. Now, across cultures, one of the most obvious difference in communication would be language. If I'm speaking German and you're speaking Swahili, and we don't speak each other's languages, the reason for the breakdown in communication becomes quite clear. But there are other ways of communicating that differ across cultures. For example, gestures or non-word vocalizations. What calls a cab in one cultural context might be harassing a person in another. And when things within a culture, there are also differences in communication across genders, ages, and power dynamics as well. The way that I might greet my childhood best friend might be different from how I'm expected to greet my boss at work, for example. Now, if there is something lost in translation, let's say between two language speakers, we realize at some point that, okay, we're not speaking the same language, we need to find a way to reach each other. And we might decide, perhaps if there's a third language that we can both speak, we might settle on English if that works. If that doesn't work, there are plenty of tools, apps, interpreters that we might rely on. We could even gesture and try and kind of mime what we're trying to get across, or we have a choice and decide, okay, we're not going to communicate. But what we hopefully will not do is conclude that because there's no communication successfully happening between the two of us, that the other person isn't somehow broken or weird or deficient. We get it. We're just not speaking the same language. Now, globally, within the broader culture, there is an understanding that communication is a two-way street, and that there are differences between cultures as well, and across cultures and within. Many organizations have some kind of training for cultural or gender or diversity sensitivity and awareness. Many schools celebrate diversity, especially cultural. They have international days, for example. So generally, there's an understanding that for communication and social interactions to work, it has to be a mutual thing, a two-way process. But there is one dimension of interpersonal difference where we don't seem to apply that same rule of mutual responsibility. And that is when it comes to neurotypes. The word neurotype refers to our neurology, so the way our brains are wired. Now, the majority of people have a mind that functions in a broadly similar way, that takes in and processes sensory information, that receives the information and sends communication out in a broadly similar way, in a way that we deem typical. So most people would be considered neurotypical. But there are also those people whose minds and brains process information and respond differently to it. And this also affects the way that they communicate. Now, these people are often referred to as neurodivergent. And one of the neurotypes that is frequently misunderstood by the neurotypical majority is autistic people. When autistic people communicate in a way that is intuitive to them, they are often seen by neurotypical people as rude or tactless, as challenging authority or being oppositional, as controlling or trying to hog the conversation or being rigid, or the big one, lacking empathy. And sometimes this breakdown in communication creates such a challenge for the interaction that this person, child or adult, may be referred to some kind of social skills training. Now, don't get me wrong, social skills are important. They help us communicate effectively, navigate social interactions, foster personal well-being, have positive interactions, build relationships, get along with others, have our needs met, negotiate boundaries, etc. Social skills are important, but most social skills training programs are overwhelmingly created to teach only neurotypical ways of interacting. They don't teach the skills in both directions. It is just one direction. And by teaching only the majority neurotypical communication style, it somehow does imply that, well, this interaction isn't working out, so you have to learn my way of communicating. It is your responsibility to make the social interaction work. And it might be that we as neurotypical people, maybe I don't get your way of communicating. It makes me uncomfortable. Maybe I think that you're not communicating at all. Or I might think that your way of communicating is wrong. And because you don't understand me in a way that I expect to be understood, you're lacking empathy. You don't have the skills to interact with me. But remember, interpersonal communication is a two-way process. So if we're only teaching one way, surely something's missing. Dr. Damian Milton, an autistic scholar and author, has addressed this by introducing the double empathy problem theory. Now, the theory of the double empathy problem states that when people of vastly different experiences of the world interact, they struggle to empathize with each other. They may struggle to communicate with each other. The communication breakdown happens because there is a breakdown of reciprocity, a breakdown in mutual understanding. And so, an autistic person may struggle to communicate with neurotypical people. A neurotypical person may frequently misinterpret autistic communication. An autistic person may have successful social interactions with other autistic people, just like neurotypical people may have successful social interactions with other neurotypical people. But the neurotypical person benefits from a society that rewards neurotypical skills. In fact, it teaches them as standard. And so the autistic person showing up in a neurotypical world may feel socially isolated in that context. And without acknowledging the double empathy problem, those who differ in the way that they communicate work incredibly hard to connect with neurotypical people. And this is exhausting, effortful. It impacts their mental health negatively. And it also interferes with their sense of self, because if you're constantly trying to adapt, how are you going to figure out who you are? Now, I'm a psychologist, and I study lots of different ways of being, but I'm not autistic. And so I can't know what it feels like to show up every day and communicate in a world that wasn't designed for me. But I can ask, and that's what I did. I asked a group of young autistic people, what does this feel like for you every day? And this is what they said. One said, I feel like a cat, trapped in a human body. Another said, I feel like a Marvel character, living in a DC world and forced to live by DC rules. One said that I feel like a main character that looks like an NPC. For the non-gamers among us, that's a non-player character. And all of them have found themselves, at some point or other, standing among a group of their peers, perplexed or frustrated or even despairing at some unspoken rule that they've broken, or a joke that they didn't get, or some subtle energy that passed among the group that they were not privy to, and asking themselves, how come everybody knows this? When did they learn this? We're the same age. Why is this so hard for me? With our newly equipped double empathy problem awareness, let's revisit some of the judgments these young autistic folk have often encountered. Were they being rude, or were they simply being direct when they were pointing out inconsistencies or answering a question honestly? When asking for additional information, for example, what's the point of learning all this in class? Or why should I do the dishes when asked to? Neurotypical people very often interpret this as challenging their authority or being difficult. You know what I mean. You're just being difficult. But in reality, that person may simply need more information in order to understand where this request fits in with the bigger picture, or how it is relevant for them so that they can do the task. And when it comes to lacking empathy, many of the young autistic people I talked to said that they were told that they were lacking empathy at least once in a situation where they were explicitly trying to show their empathy. For example, when a neurotypical friend shared she was sad because her cat died that morning, the autistic friend started talking about the time when her dog died and how she struggled with that. Not to make it all about herself, which is what she was told, but to share a relatable story so her friend knows that she's understood. That reminds me of something that happens to me, or that happened to me. It's often a way that at least members of the group that I talked to started to share and show their empathy. And so maybe it is not so much that autistic people don't read social cues. It may also be that non-autistic people send a whole lot of ambiguous social cues that don't consider neurodivergent social communication. It goes both ways. The one whose brain works differently cannot always be the responsible for making the interaction work. And so, a small dog is not a misbehaving cat. And autistic communication is not a lack of neurotypical skills. Maybe what we really need to do is not try to change autistic people to make them fit in. Instead, we should work on changing society so that everyone is more accepting and supportive of different ways of being and communicating. Social interaction is a two-way street. Let's all meet in the middle. Thank you.